Welcome to One Nation Underdog. I'm Mark Harvey. When we talk about globalization, quite often we think about the plight of workers throughout the world, in the international system, outside the United States, but in the United States as well. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a worker. Not so much their standards or where they're at, what they're doing, but rather the fact that capitalism actually sets up a situation where workers are often treated as commodities. And so we'll talk about that and what some of the implications are as we enter the classroom.
Well, I will say there's many problems with globalization, and some of the biggest ones have to do with labor.
Where labor goes,
Where people take advantage of the cheapest labor.
what the status of people are in those countries, whether or not they're exploited. These are all issues that really are directly concerned with globalization as well.
Welcome to Crazy Mark's used car lot and law firm. They don't call me crazy for nothing. I'll tell you what, we got great cars out on the car lot. Like, for instance, we have a 1976 Pacer X. Looks a whole lot like this one right here. It is indeed the sporty model. Well, it looks a lot like this one, except, of course, the one we got out on the rack there has got a custom-made luggage rack on the top. We got, this thing's a fishbowl on wheels. I'll tell you, it is fine piece of automobile machinery. Man, you would not be able to get any women unless you find yourself in one of these here cars. So, you say you want some legal services? Have you been injured? Would you like to be injured? Have you been jilted by a former lover? Well, we can take it to court. We can take care of you right here. We can get money. We have great solutions here for you here at Crazy Mark's used car lot and law firm.
I would argue there's basically two problems of globalization with labor. The first one is that workers become devalued and interchangeable like commodities.
We're used to thinking about supply and demand in terms of buying things like cars on a car lot or going shopping. What we're less inclined to think about is supply and demand in terms of the labor market.
But really, what happens when you have too many, too much of anything? Too many lawyers in the economy, for example.
You get too many silly lawsuits.
The value of their labor goes down, or at least it's supposed to go down, right?
Well, if you think about it, it's true. Lawyers try to create a market for their services. When they can't find work, when they can't expand their market, they have to lower their rates or do something else, or desperately try to expand their market like you see on those commercials that encourage lawsuits.
You get desperate enough to get a little bit of education, helps you out. That's one reason why you guys are here, is that the more education you get, the more unique you are in the workplace, and that raises your value. It's a supply and demand argument.
That's why education is important to developed economies. Without education, you can't adapt if there is too much of any one sort of profession.
And ask the same question about doctors, right?
Under supply and demand, we pay doctors more because there are fewer of them that have put up with so much school and specialize in that one little operational procedure they know how to do.
Who's going to make more money, the general practitioner or the brain surgeon? Brain surgeon, why is that? Highly specialized. See, so now in the labor market, it works exactly the same way as it does with business. Is that if you specialize in something, then that enhances your value. You become something that's rare, something that's special. But those are a couple of white-collar examples, right? But a lot of times we think about this a little bit more frequently when we think about blue-collar jobs.
Let's talk about auto workers now. It used to be there was a high demand for them in this country because we were producing so many cars.
The automobile industry was a leading-edge industry throughout the 20th century. And if you go to the very beginning, if you were a person who made cars at this point, or fixed cars, what was your salary going to be like? Really high, okay? Because there's only so many people who know how to make them, only so many people who know how to fix them. You need a specialist. You need somebody who actually knows how to fix every aspect of a car, okay? Now what happens is as an industry matures, and this definitely was true in the auto industry, you take on certain things that make your industry more efficient. One of these things is called economies of scale. Okay? Economies of scale basically means the more of something you get, it's sort of like buying in bulk. The more of something that you buy, the more things you get access to, the more it drives your prices down. Okay, so if you get to be a really big industry, you can have access to resources and materials in large quantities. That helps your bottom line. But another thing that helps that a lot are just the efficiencies that happen in terms of technology and in terms of labor. And obviously in the auto industry we had certain advances that occurred in terms of the assembly line, interchangeable parts. I mean, we went from a situation where you needed one guy to be able to fix a car entirely to a situation where now you only need one guy to spot weld. Right? You only need one guy to put in a window. You only need one person to work a riveter, right? So what's the difference in the knowledge base between the guy who knows absolutely everything about making a car and somebody who basically just knows how to do one thing? I mean, the answer is that the person who basically just has to spot weld doesn't need the same level of education as somebody who needs to know about absolutely everything. Okay? So if I need somebody who's an auto worker throughout the mid-20th century, do I need somebody who's educated? No.
Not necessarily.
I need somebody who can push a button. And how many people can do that? So what kind of job applications am I going to get in those circumstances? Lots and lots and lots and lots of them. Okay? Now, if I get that many job applications, what's going to happen to the value of their labor? It's going to go down.
So let's say you're a CEO and your productivity is increasing and you don't need high-skilled workers to do a particular job. You will probably lay off workers that are at the top of the pay scale and hire low-skilled workers for less. There are so many workers who can do the job you want. What happens to the value of the worker? It goes down.
The value of labor starts up right up here, but as the industry grows, the value of the labor goes down and down and down as the industry becomes more efficient. Is that true of the auto industry? That the price of labor has gone lower and lower and lower dramatically as we become more efficient? Kind of. Okay, why?
The unions.
Oh crap, there's unions.
Unions get organized, they increase or maintain the levels of wages among workers. The government gets involved, ensures minimum wages. They get involved and increase regulations on businesses.
Geez, it's like if we had a free market, we didn't have all this government intervention and minimum wages and allowing the wage. And look, wages could just be whatever they're going to be, right? I mean, we shouldn't have to pay somebody so much if all they do is push a button, right? Okay? But now we've got unions, and unions then organize on behalf of laborers to try to improve their conditions or improve their wages or whatever. What happens to the value of those wages?
Up. Going on.
Wages go up, exactly. So you're kind of stuck.
There comes a breaking point where you think, man, I could make so much more money if I could pay these people less, if you're still that same CEO.
As a business, you want to try to avoid these high labor values. You don't want the unions. You don't want all this other stuff. You want to try to operate it as an efficient as possible. And part of that, and keep in mind that in terms of the expenses of a business, labor is going to be one of your top. Right? So anything you can do to try to control or limit that is going to be a pretty big deal.
Keep in mind with the sweatshop thing too, this is also an issue of supply and demand like we talked about before, where how easy is it to just round up kids to do just about anything in absolutely desperate economic conditions. You can pay them 10 cents a day, you can pay them 6 cents a day. What if this kid says, no, I'm sorry, that's too low, or the conditions aren't good, or whatever? What happens? You just go to another kid. So, we're not talking about the going wage or like what is relative to that economy. We're talking about, at least human rights people would argue, the circumstances being so dire that if you're a multinational corporation, you're able to go in there and take advantage of the fact that cheap, unethical labor is in high abundance because nobody's there to enforce or even set any standards along those lines.
This is actually a quote from my friend Karl Marx. Yeah, seriously, 1844. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and range. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion to the devaluation of the world of men. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and does so in the proportion in which it produces commodities generally. Does that make sense? I mean, he's right, isn't he? He's basically arguing that Once an industry becomes extremely efficient, then the worker becomes a commodity. They become something that you can buy and sell, the same as the product itself. And the more successful it is, the more the worker is a commodity.
I know it's sad, but it's capitalism. The market determines what is just and what is not just. It might not be right, but that's life. People get fired. So the moral of the story, the market, via supply and demand, raises and lowers the cost of labor.
And so from a corporate social responsibility angle, one question that's worth asking is it worth it for you as a company to pay this kid or adults or whatever more than what the market bears? Just because the market says that it bears a certain amount doesn't necessarily mean that that's the just amount. How easy is it to get just round up kids to do just about anything in absolutely desperate economic conditions? You can pay them 10 cents a day, you can pay them 6 cents a day. You know, what if this kid says, no, I'm sorry, that's too low, or the conditions aren't good, or whatever? What happens? You just go to another kid. So, you know, we're not talking about the going wage or like what is relative to that economy. We're talking about, at least human rights people would argue, the circumstances being so dire that if you're a multinational corporation, you're able to go in there and take advantage of the fact that cheap, unethical labor is in high abundance because nobody's there to enforce or even set any standards. That's just how much it is you can pay for somebody before you just start turning people away and send them down. But on the other hand, maybe that's good business sense. If that's what the market calls for, maybe that's all you should be concerned with as a business.